The sun had not yet touched the horizon when the sound of spurs echoed through the New Mexico desert. It was 1881, and the Old West was boiling between law and chaos. Pat Garrett, the man who had once been Billy the Kid's friend, now followed his trail with a mission that destiny itself seemed to have written: to hunt down and kill the territory's most famous gunslinger. But what few know is that this story didn't begin with hatred. It was born from trust, from laughter shared in dusty taverns and the illusion that two men could survive in a world where the law was worth less than a silver dollar. Billy, still called Henry McCarty by some, was a boy lost among rancher wars and broken promises. Intelligent, quick with guns, and charismatic enough to make friends and enemies on the same night. Garrett knew him before the fame and before the headlines transformed him into a legendary outlaw. Together, they crossed dangerous trails, faced rivals, and drank under the same roof, swearing loyalty to each other. But the West changes men, and the line between hero and villain has never been so thin. When Garrett accepted the sheriff's badge, fate sealed his choice. He became the hunter of a man he knew better than himself. They say Pat didn't do it for money, nor for glory, but out of necessity, perhaps to survive in a world that devoured those who hesitated. Others claim it was pure betrayal, the selling of a friend's soul for political prestige. The truth, like everything in the West, was lost among the dust of the roads and the versions told around campfires. In those days, news traveled slower than a tired mule, and legends grew faster than gunpowder. Billy the Kid was already a living ghost, and every man who met him had his own version of what he saw. Pat Garrett, the former companion, would be the only one to close the myth, or at least try. And as the stars began to appear over the Fort Sumner Mountains, a final encounter was taking shape. The house was dark, the air heavy with foreboding. Garrett held his revolver with steady hands, but a divided heart. On the other side, perhaps Billy, the Kid, laughed for the last time. The night in Fort Sumner was hot and silent, the kind of silence that carries the weight of the inevitable. The wind dragged dust through the cracks of Peter Maxwell's old house, the ranch where Billy the Kid sought refuge. The young gunslinger was tired. The escapes, the ambushes, the dead friends, everything was beginning to weigh on him, even for someone who lived smiling in the face of danger. Billy believed that there, among a few familiar faces, he would find some peace. He didn't know that, at the same time, Pat Garrett was riding to that very place, guided by information that would lead him straight to his old companion. Garrett hadn't slept for days. His eyes held the shadow of someone who carries more than the responsibility of the law. He carried the memory of a friend. Since Billy's spectacular escape from the Lincoln jail, where he killed two men and disappeared like a ghost, Pat had been pressured by the territory's powerful men. Rich men, owners of cattle and land, demanded that he do what he promised, put an end to the life of the outlaw who defied authority and shamed the government. It was that, or lose everything. But within him, there was more doubt than determination. As he rode, he remembered the time when Billy was not the Kid, but just a young man with blue eyes and an easy smile. Pat saw in him a spark of hope, a rebelliousness that, if shaped, could have been transformed into something great. Billy had the gift of leadership, of inspiring even the toughest gunslingers. But the world gives no room for idealists in the Old West. Those who don't choose a side end up buried in the middle of the desert. That night, Billy arrived at the ranch without suspicion. He wore his hat low and carried a piece of goat meat in his hands. Inside the house, he asked Maxwell who was staying there. The ranch owner hesitated. The sound of Pat's voice came from the darkness. Billy, curious, asked in Spanish, "¿Quién es?" And before any word could cross the air, a shot cut through the silence. The sound echoed through the walls like dry thunder. Billy the Kid fell with no time to draw his weapon. Some say he died instantly. Others swear he still murmured something, perhaps the name of the man he once called friend. But the truth is that no one can say for sure what happened in that room. Garrett swore it was a reflex shot, that he thought he was facing another armed man. The few present told different versions, and over the years, the story became a thick fog of rumors. There were those who said Garrett killed the wrong man, that the buried body was not Billy's, and that the real Kid lived for decades under another name, hidden in the far reaches of Texas. There are even records of an old man named Brushy Bill Roberts, who swore to be Billy the Kid and asked for forgiveness from the governor of New Mexico. But who would believe a ghost asking for redemption? What is known is that Pat Garrett, after that shot, was never the same again. He returned to his life as sheriff, but the brightness in his eyes was gone. People looked at him with suspicion. Some called him a hero, others a traitor. The reward was small, and the fame bitter. Billy had become a legend, and no one loves the one who kills a legend. Garrett came to be haunted not only by Billy's memory, but by doubt. Had he done the right thing? Or had he sold his soul to politics and the powerful? The Old West continued its transformation. Railroads advanced, frontiers narrowed, and the days of gunslingers were coming to an end. Garrett tried to adapt, invested in land, tried the life of a rancher, but seemed always pursued by a cruel fate. His enemies grew, and old allies disappeared. Decades later, he would be the one to die mysteriously, ambushed on a dusty road with a bullet in his back. Ironically, the same fate he gave Billy. Some see in this a settling of accounts by the West itself, a cycle that closes, because in the end, all the men who challenged the territory's laws ended up defeated by the same enemy, time. Billy the Kid became a symbol of freedom, of youth that does not bow. Garrett, on the other hand, became the portrait of guilt, of the man who obeyed the law, but lost his soul in the process. And between them, the border between myth and truth remained forever blurred. A few years after Billy's death, stories began circulating that he had been seen in taverns, on distant ranches, even in Mexico. With each new version, the myth grew. Bullets found, letters signed with the name Henry McCarty, testimonies from old companions. Everything fed the doubt. What if Garrett had lied? What if the Old West, with all its dust and blood, had kept one more secret? Those who studied the case claimed that the body buried in Fort Sumner was never conclusively identified. The tombstone, simple and worn, bears 3 names: Pals, Billy the Kid. But even this is contested. There were those who said that Garrett, pressured and fearful, killed another man and staged Billy's death to end the hunt. Others believe that both planned the farce together and that Garrett helped him disappear. This version, however improbable it may seem, fits into a friendship so deep that perhaps it could only end this way, with a silent pact. But if that's what happened, neither of them told. Garrett kept silent until the end of his life. And Billy, if he survived, took the secret with him to the grave. The West, after all, is made of stories told around the fire, mixing truths, lies, and longing. Each man chooses which version to believe. What remains is the image: 2 men crossing the same path, united by respect and separated by circumstances. One representing the law, the other freedom. One killing to fulfill his duty, the other dying to keep his own name alive. That's why, even more than a century later, the echo of the shot in Fort Sumner still resonates. Not just as the sound of Billy the Kid's death, but as the moment when the Old West lost its innocence. As time advanced, history became spectacle. Books, ballads, and films transformed Billy into a romantic hero, a symbol of resistance against power. Garrett, on the contrary, became the villain, the man who betrayed his friend. But perhaps the mistake is right there, believing there were heroes or villains. In the West, everyone fought only to survive, and sometimes surviving meant killing one's own past. In the last years of his life, Garrett was seen wandering among towns, trying to sell rights to the book that told his version of the facts. No one wanted to buy it. The people preferred the legend. And legends, as is known, never die. Billy continued alive in stories, in songs, in the memories of those who believed he was more than an outlaw, that he was the last free spirit of an era that was fading away. And so, between truth and myth, what still echoes in the stories of the West is born. The friendship that became tragedy, the shot that separated 2 destinies, and the certainty that, as long as there is someone telling his story, Billy the Kid will never rest in peace. Years after the shot in Fort Sumner, New Mexico was no longer the same. Cities grew, the dust of stagecoaches gave way to the sound of locomotives, and old gunslingers began to disappear like forgotten ghosts. But Billy the Kid's name still echoed in every saloon, in every song played by violinists who swore they had seen the brightness of his eyes on moonlit nights. The people needed to believe he was still alive because accepting his death was accepting that the West had changed forever. Pat Garrett tried to continue his life amid that change. The man who had once been celebrated as a hero was now avoided in the streets. Many looked at him with suspicion, others with silent hatred. What once seemed like justice now sounded like betrayal. He himself no longer knew what he felt. He slept poorly, woke up startled, reliving the moment of the shot. Billy's voice calling in the darkness, the dry sound of the bullet, the body falling to the ground. Sometimes he woke up convinced that everything had been a nightmare. Other times, he swore he heard footsteps behind him, light, quick, like Billy's. And for an instant, he believed that the boy still followed him, laughing at the irony of it all. Garrett still had allies among the ranchers, men who hired him to resolve disputes, watch over lands, and ensure that cattle thieves didn't destroy their businesses. But he was no longer the same fearless man as before. He avoided looking people in the eyes, spoke little, and drank too much. Guilt weighed heavy, and the Old West no longer tolerated broken men. The frontier demanded firmness, and those who showed weakness ended up swallowed. Garrett, little by little, became a stranger in his own territory. Meanwhile, stories about Billy multiplied. Some said he had been seen in Chihuahua, working as a cowboy under another name. Others claimed he had crossed the border and become a hired gun in Texas. Each new rumor reignited the flame of doubt, and Garrett was the first to feel the weight of these narratives. He denied it, of course, but sometimes, alone, he let his mind wander through this possibility. What if Billy really had escaped? What if that body buried in Fort Sumner was another man's? The idea tormented him, but also relieved him. Because if Billy was still alive, perhaps Garrett wasn't the traitor the world said he was, just a friend who let him escape. In 1903, more than 2 decades after Billy's supposed end, an elderly man appeared in Hico, Texas. He was called Brushy Bill Roberts and said with conviction that he was the real Billy the Kid. He had scars on his body that matched the descriptions, new details that only the real Henry McCarty could know. The man sought the governor of New Mexico to ask for the pardon promised years before, the one that never came. Many ridiculed him, others swore he was telling the truth. The most curious thing was that Pat Garrett never came to confirm or deny the story. He had already been killed 2 years earlier, ambushed on the Las Cruces Road. Garrett's death was as enigmatic as Billy's. He was riding alone when he was shot in the back. No one could say for sure who killed him. Some pointed to old enemies, others to land disputes, and there are those who say it was a delayed revenge, orchestrated by someone who still carried the kid's name on their lips. The man who killed Billy the Kid died the same way the boy lived, without warning, without trial, and without reliable witnesses. The cycle seemed complete, as if the West had charged the price for so much betrayal and blood. But the stories once again refused to die. The people preferred to believe that the destinies of the two were intertwined until the end. There were those who said Garrett was killed by someone who knew too much, someone who wanted to bury the truth about Billy once and for all. Others believed that Billy himself, aged and disguised, returned to settle the score. The fact is that no document, no concrete proof, managed to close the debate. And perhaps that is the true charm of this story, the fact that it lives in uncertainty, on the border between the real and the legendary. Over the years, books began to shape the myth. Writers transformed Billy into a symbol of indomitable youth, of the free spirit that refused to bow before the law, the orphan boy, the smiling gunslinger, the outlaw who never lost his charm. In contrast, Garrett came to be remembered as the man who sold his soul for a badge. Few remembered that he too was a survivor, a man who tried to maintain order in a world that was falling apart. But in the popular imagination, there is no room for nuances. The people wanted a hero and a traitor, and so it was done. Some chroniclers of the time recorded that Garrett, shortly before dying, was obsessed with retelling his version of the facts. He tried to publish a book, trying to justify every step, every decision. He said that the world had not understood the weight of what he had done, that Billy was, at the same time, a friend and a threat, that if he had let him live, he would have condemned himself. But the public didn't want to hear it. They wanted the romance, the myth of the invincible boy. And Garrett, no matter how hard he tried, never managed to free himself from the shadow of the gunslinger he killed. The relationship between the two transcended history and became metaphor. The hunter and the hunted, the friend and the enemy, the mirror and the reflection. Some say that Garrett and Billy were two sides of the same man, the idealist and the pragmatist, the dream and the guilt. One wouldn't exist without the other, and perhaps that's why their lives were so tragically intertwined. The West seemed too small for the two of them, and fate, ruthless enough to place them face to face. In the following years, the figure of Billy the Kid spread like fire. Ballads appeared in his honor, theatrical plays, stories printed in pamphlets that circulated at fairs and taverns. Each new author added a detail, a feat, an emotion. Billy became a legend because he represented what people feared losing: wild freedom. The right to live without bowing, to laugh in the face of death, to challenge fate. And the more time passed, the more distant the truth became. Garrett, for his part, was forgotten. His grave remained simple, without flowers, visited only by the curious and scholars. Few remembered that he too was a man surrounded by dilemmas. His story became a newspaper footnote, a footnote in books that exalted Billy. The legend needed a villain, and Garrett served that role well. But those who truly studied the Old West know that nothing there was black and white. Every bullet fired had a story behind it. Every death hid motivations that went far beyond what the song said. Time continued to transform everything. What was once desert became road. Where shots once echoed, today small towns rose. But Billy the Kid's name endured. In museums, plaques, and old photographs, he still smiles with that look between defiance and innocence. No one knows for sure whether he was criminal or hero, but everyone agrees on one thing: he embodied the spirit of the West, the last flash of an era when man was master of his own destiny. And it is precisely this duality, between the boy and the myth, between the friend and the enemy, that keeps the story alive today. In the end, what remained were not documents, nor proofs, nor official versions. What remained was the echo of stories told by the campfire, passed from generation to generation, shaped by those who needed to believe in something greater. And, with each new narrator, Billy the Kid is reborn, sometimes as hero, sometimes as bandit, but always as a symbol of the freedom that the West once represented. Time transformed the Old West into memory and dust, but Billy the Kid's name continued to cross borders, gaining new meanings as times changed and the eyes that observed him. In the early 20th century, when the territory of New Mexico sought recognition and political stability, the gunslinger's ghost was invoked again as a symbol of a past that refused to die. People no longer just wanted to know who he was, but what he represented. And amid this fever of curiosity, every old companion, every forgotten witness, began to reconstruct in their own way what they lived alongside the boy who defied the law and became legend. One of Billy's old allies, a man named John Meter, claimed to have traveled with him shortly before the supposed fatal encounter with Garrett. He said the kid seemed tired, but not defeated, that he spoke of leaving everything behind, going to Mexico, perhaps starting over under another name. This narrative reinforced the idea that Billy did not die in that Fort Sumner house, but rather escaped with the help of someone who owed him more than words. That someone, they said, could have been Pat Garrett himself. The stories were repeated fervently in the saloons and fairs of New Mexico, feeding the myth of a friendship that transcended death. Meanwhile, archaeologists and scholars began to revisit the place where Billy would have been buried. They discovered bullet marks, bones, and personal objects, but nothing that could confirm the body's identity with certainty. The simple tombstone, marked by sandstorms and vandalism, was a symbol of uncertainty. Every attempt to bring answers seemed only to create new questions. What no one denied was the power of attraction that tomb exerted. Pilgrims, curious people, and history lovers traveled miles just to see the place where the boy would have fallen. And the more time passed, the more alive Billy's figure remained. While the gunslinger's image was strengthened, Pat Garrett's sank into shadow. Official records showed a man who tried to be a rancher, politician, and even writer. He tried to clean his own name, but history seemed to resist any attempt at redemption. The public saw him as the traitor, the man who traded friendship for glory. Even among former law partners, few defended him. The Old West never forgave well those who killed their idols, and Pat carried that weight until the end, never managing to free himself from the ghost of the boy he killed. Newspapers of the time began to explore the human side of this rivalry. They described Garrett as a tormented man, isolated, consumed by guilt and drink. Some reports claimed he kept unsent letters, written to Billy, in which he tried to justify what he had done. Other stories spoke of nights when he was seen talking to himself, as if expecting answers that would never come. No man can escape the past when his name is linked to a legend. Garrett seemed to know this and, even so, continued trying to understand what fate had imposed on him. In parallel, Billy the Kid's name began to cross the limits of history and definitively enter the territory of popular culture. In the 1920s, writers and filmmakers began to transform the gunslinger into the protagonist of heroic adventures. In films, he was portrayed as a charming young man, with an easy laugh, fighting against corrupt sheriffs and big ranchers. Cinema needed a hero, and Billy was the perfect mold. Little did the truth matter. The legend had taken shape, and the silver screen consolidated it forever. The public vibrated with the bullets and duels, with the boy who faced the world and never surrendered. It was the spirit of the West transformed into spectacle. While Billy's image was romanticized, scholars began to revisit documents and testimonies. They discovered that the real Henry McCarty was only 21 years old when he died, that he spoke Spanish fluently, that he was educated and gentle, but also ruthless when he needed to be. He was a man of contradictions, a murderer for some, a vigilante for others. The witnesses who knew him described him as someone of playful nature, but capable of absolute coldness in combat. The contrast between the myth and the real man became increasingly evident, but no one seemed willing to accept the raw version of the facts. The public wanted to believe in the rebellious boy who faced power and paid the price. The most curious thing is that, even decades after his death, new Billies began to emerge. Men in small towns, claiming the gunslinger's identity, presenting scars, old letters, and fragmented memories. Some seemed to seek fame. Others perhaps just truly believed they carried that spirit. The case of Brushy Bill Roberts was the most famous, but not the only one. Others appeared in Arizona, in Texas, and even on the Mexican border. Each new supposed kid brought with him more mystery, more discussion, more fascination. And the myth expanded, as if Billy himself had decided never to truly die. Pat Garrett's figure also began to be revisited by a new type of researcher. Some saw him as a tragic man, trapped between loyalty and duty. They argued that he had no choice, that he was pushed by circumstances and by the pressure of the powerful, that his friendship with Billy did not prevent him from understanding that if he didn't hunt him, he would be hunted as well. This view tried to balance the narrative, showing that the Old West was not made of heroes and villains, but of survivors. Still, the public preferred the romance. The story of a betrayed friend sold more than that of a man trapped in his own destiny. Between 1930 and 1950, the United States experienced the height of Western cinema, and Billy the Kid became one of the most portrayed characters of the era. Hundreds of versions emerged, some faithful, others completely invented. He was sometimes a bandit, sometimes a vigilante, sometimes a victim. In each film, a new layer of interpretation was added to the legend, and the more the myth grew, the more distant the truth became. Screenwriters transformed the story of Billy and Garrett into Greek tragedy, two men destined to face each other, condemned by their own loyalty. At the same time, newspaper writers from New Mexico began to publish investigative articles, trying to separate what was fact from what was fiction. They discovered documents that suggested Garrett was politically manipulated, used by local interests to eliminate a symbol of resistance that bothered the powerful. Other documents showed that Billy, in many cases, was only reacting to the persecution and injustices of the Lincoln County War, where the big ranchers dominated the law. These discoveries did not erase the crimes committed, but shed light on the context that shaped those choices. Billy was not just a gunslinger. He was a product of a time without rules, of a society in formation where strength and loyalty were worth more than any decree. In the end, what began as the story of an orphaned Irish boy lost in the plains of New Mexico was transformed into a mirror of the American soul itself, a portrait of how freedom can become sin and justice a burden. Billy the Kid symbolized the indomitable spirit that founded the West, and Pat Garrett, the inevitable arrival of order. The clash between these two worlds never ended. It only changed form. Even after death, they continued to represent the eternal conflict between man and the destiny that pursues him. The descendants of Billy and Garrett still tried to retell their versions. Families, lawyers, and historians disputed the right to prove who was right. They even requested exhumations, compared bones, analyzed DNA, but the earth kept its secrets firmly. No test was able to bring a definitive answer. Each new attempt only rekindled the controversy and strengthened the myth. Because perhaps deep down, no one really wanted to discover the truth. Uncertainty was what kept the flame of history alive, and the West, with all its brutality and beauty, always preferred myths to proofs. Decades passed, and the echo of the name Billy the Kid still floated over the New Mexico desert like an old song that the wind refuses to forget. Time took witnesses, erased footprints, destroyed records, but could not silence the voice of legend. The boy who laughed in the face of death continued alive in travelers' conversations, in history books, and in the broken promises of a West that never bowed. It no longer mattered whether Billy had died that night in 1881, or if he escaped through the shadows with Garrett's own help. What remained was the myth, and the myth, unlike men, does not age. In the early 20th century, the frontiers of the West had been tamed. Railroads crossed the valleys, cities expanded, and sheriffs, once feared, now served a more bureaucratic than heroic system. But, at fairs and taverns, Billy's name still made money. Fake photos, forged relics, invented letters were sold. Any object that could carry the weight of the past found a buyer. The boy who once stole horses was now exploited as a symbol of rebellion, the icon of the free, wild, indomitable man. And each new generation rediscovered him in their own way. In the 1950s, scholars began to seek definitive proof about what really happened in Fort Sumner. They excavated the cemetery, compared accounts, confronted medical records, but all they found were contradictions. The grave identified as Billy's did not correspond exactly to the descriptions of the time. Witnesses disagreed about the body's height, the position of the wound, even the clothes he wore. It was as if the desert itself conspired to keep the secret. Every attempt to unveil the truth seemed to bring the legend closer to immortality. The public didn't want certainties. They wanted to keep believing. Meanwhile, Pat Garrett's name remained tarnished. His murder, in 1908, continued shrouded in doubt. Some said he was killed over a land dispute, others that the crime was commissioned by powerful men who feared what he might reveal. The body was found fallen by the roadside, with his hat fallen beside him and his revolver still in its holster. No culprit was convicted, and for many that end was just destiny correcting an old injustice. The West collected its debts silently, but infallibly. Over the years, writers and historians began to understand that the story of Billy and Garrett was not just about crime and persecution. It was about the birth of a country in conflict with its own conscience. Billy represented the rebellious spirit that refused to accept impositions. Garrett, the symbol of order that sought stability at any cost. Two men trapped in the gears of a time when there was no room for middle ground. And the shot in Fort Sumner ceased to be just the end of a hunt to become the portrait of an era saying goodbye to itself. In modern United States, Billy the Kid became more than a historical figure. He became an archetype. His face graced magazine covers, movie posters, folk songs, and country ballads. Artists and writers found in him the essence of the American anti-hero, the man who lives outside the law, but within his own code. Each new adaptation transformed him according to the spirit of its time. In the 60s, he was a symbol of rebellious youth. In the 80s, a pop icon. In all versions, the same question remained unanswered. Was he a murderer or a victim of destiny? With each new decade, new researchers emerged claiming to have discovered the final truth. Some claimed to possess documents that proved Garrett killed the wrong man. Others claimed to have letters written by Billy after his supposed death. No proof withstood scrutiny. Still, interest only grew. History had become a mirror. The more people sought to understand Billy, the more they revealed about themselves. And perhaps, that has been the secret of his legend's longevity. It speaks more about who tells it than about who lived it. In New Mexico, small towns began to erect monuments in honor of both. In Fort Sumner, a museum was created to preserve objects and documents related to the case. Visitors from around the world walked the same dusty roads, trying to imagine the sound of Billy's footsteps, the brightness of Garrett's gaze, the weight of silence before the shot. It was as if time had stopped there, freezing forever that moment when friendship and betrayal became confused under the moonlight. The debate about the pardon promised to Billy also gained strength again. Old documents showed that Governor Lew Wallace really had considered pardoning the boy in exchange for testimony in the Lincoln County War. Billy fulfilled his part of the agreement, but the pardon never came. Some historians claim that this political betrayal was the definitive breaking point, which made the boy an outlaw by choice, not by destiny. The government's failure to fulfill the promise transformed him into an enemy of the system, and ironically, into a popular hero. It was the reflection of the country. Justice promised, but never delivered. Meanwhile, Garrett's figure continued to divide opinions. Part of the historians tried to rehabilitate him, remembering that he lived in a time when the line between law and crime was too thin. Others said he allowed himself to be corrupted by power and the need for recognition. There are those who claim that, until the end of his life, Garrett still kept the badge that made him famous, but not out of pride, but as a reminder of the price he paid, a symbol of the loneliness of those who fulfill their duty, even when duty condemns them. The West modernized, but the landscape still bears marks of that era. The hills of Lincoln, the ruins of Fort Sumner, the rails that cross the desert, everything seems to preserve a silence that speaks for itself. And when the wind blows through the stones, there are those who say they can hear the echo of distant laughter, the sound of spurs, and the murmur of a friendship that time could not bury. For local residents, Billy was never just an outlaw. He was the spirit of the land, unpredictable, free, and impossible to tame. Today, more than a century later, Billy the Kid's face continues to look at the world through a faded photograph, taken when he was just a boy trying to survive. A light look, almost innocent, that contrasts with the weight of his fame. That solitary image, kept in museums and collections, became a symbol of the myth. It is the portrait of an era and of a man who perhaps never existed, as they say, but who represents everything the West was, and everything that human beings still seek: freedom, redemption, and the illusion that it is possible to escape one's own destiny. And so, the story that began with two friends crossing the roads of New Mexico continues to be told. Between dust and memory, between fact and invention, Billy the Kid still rides, invisible, but present, in the stories that men tell when the fire is low and the night is too long to be silent.